Hi there. This is an analysis podcast going over everything we know from the books about what the Night's Watch was like at the time of the Dance of the Dragons. It's a follow-up to my earlier report video, which was only 10 minutes long, showing spy footage from the set of House of the Dragon Season 2, revealing that they're inventing a Night's Watch subplot, that we will see the Wall again, which didn't happen in the books, didn't happen in Fire and Blood. It's not too big of an invention, we're really welcoming it, that Jace does go to visit Winterfell to meet the Starks. Might as well have a side adventure showing what's going on at the Wall, and maybe even revealing other backstory things with them of the growing threat of the White Walkers we don't really know. But because we didn't visit them specifically in this time period in the books, we can only infer some things from stray mentions. So what I did is I sat down, used an electronic search to go over any mention of the Night's Watch in Fire and Blood, and then other references from wiki articles and e-search about, like, a stray mention in A Clash of Kings about exactly when such and such castle was abandoned, or various historical events, and I contextualized all of it. So this is more or less what we can tell about it. It's never been done before. We've never really thought out, well, what would they be like during the Dance of the Dragons? And this is just audio only as a podcast. This is presenting my research. It would take too long to make it more succinct, edit it with pictures and stuff. I'll make a follow-up video when we see more in Season 2 itself, contextualizing, well, relative to what the book said, how does that stack up? This is just, I sat down and researched it, I'm sharing my notes with you. Though I have, typed this up formally. It's about 5 pages of notes. And this is for future use. It wouldn't make sense to make this really slick, really full of images and transitions video right now, and succinctly 15 minutes long, when not a lot of people would watch it because the filming is over. We're in the off season now, but this is setting up future videos on the Night's Watch when we see more in Season 2. Just everything we could tell. Now, we know what they're like in Game of Thrones, of course, and when Jon Snow gets there, there's barely 1,000 men left, and they're only manning 3 out of 19 castles. Though we know from other stuff they never manned all 19 at the same time. That may have been as many as 18 at one point. But, like, the Night Fort was replaced by another one directly, but they're down to 3, and they only have 1,000 men. Fire and Blood, and actually the beginning part about the conquest in Fire and Blood, is just a straight copy of the short 10,000-word conquest chapter from The World of Ice and Fire. So Fire and Blood came out 2018, but we've known this since 2014 when The World of Ice and Fire came out, and it was this long 10,000-word sidebar by George R. R. Martin on the Conquest era that it did say in that, we've known for about 10 years. Stray mentioned that at the time of Aegon's conquest, the Night's Watch had 10,000 men. And the Lord Commander at the time was like a brother of Harrenhal, but he chose not to come. He stayed true to his vows, didn't come south to help him or anything, not that it would have done much good. But we have a firm baseline of they had 10,000 men, start of the conquest, and the conquest dried up their recruitment from the losing sides of the wars between the Seven Kingdoms. So 300 years later, by the time Jon Snow got there, it was down to 1,000. Dance of the Dragons is sort of in the midpoint of that. It's roughly 170 years before Game of Thrones. It's the year 129, year 130-ish. So 130, 150 years into a 300-year reign. They'd be chronologically at the halfway point. That doesn't mean we can just assume what the numbers would be on a gradual decline. They wouldn't be. So what can we infer? What can we, with citations, what can we base on? Okay, this is everything we know from the books, but what they might be like, so we can measure their invented subplot in Season 2 against what we do know. And I hope this is helpful. Well, to start off, like a research paper, I need to state my conclusion at the beginning. The short version is, they might actually have fewer men at the time of the Dance of the Dragons than they did in Jon Snow's time. that I mentally, I always made assumptions. I would just assume, oh, I guess they're halfway through. It'd be like they started with 10,000, halfway through they'd have 5,000. It doesn't work like that. That if you actually look at the factors at play here, they might have fewer men than the 1,000 they had when Jon Snow got there. But bizarrely, they're also probably at the best level of funding they've ever had since the Long Night itself. So when you see them, I talked about this briefly in the video where I was showing the footage of them, you'd expect them to have really high quality gear with matching armor and horses, not the rags and battered hand-me-downs we saw by Game of Thrones. And the spy footage matches this. Just, it was really good spy footage because they went down a public road and people walked right up to them. We saw a dozen Night's Watch Rangers all riding horses, and they have good quality matching gear and matching horses. That you'd expect that level of funding, and they'll emphasize this more in the design videos and stuff, and if we actually see the wall and see Castle Black again, which we know they're building a top of the wall set at least, like, how different would it look when you have a much better funded Night's Watch? But the contrast of that with they probably have their lowest recruitment numbers ever. So the way I'm going to go through this is, the bulk of this is going over, well, what would their manpower levels be? Then funding, and last, what castles were still manned at this time period, because a lot of them had been abandoned, but there's other ones that were abandoned by Jon Snow's time that wouldn't have been abandoned by now. So, jumping in here, big section, manpower. Two big factors to consider post-conquest. First is, they don't have a steady flow of men anymore, but they get a recruitment surge every time there's a major continent-wide civil war. Again, before the Targaryen unification, it says there was never a generation in which at least one of the independent Seven Kingdoms wasn't at war with one of the other ones. After the unification, they go without a major war for at least a couple of decades, then have a bigger civil war across all of Westeros, bigger wars than they ever had, but they happen every generation or two, on an unprecedented scale. Things like the Blackfire Rebellion, or particularly the big example is Robert's Rebellion. So it's not like you're just drawing a straight line of this decline on a graph. It has spikes and surges after major civil wars. And at other times, it drops off to a trickle. They don't get that many men, and they're of low quality. In peacetime, when there truly is peace across all the Seven Kingdoms, it's just thieves, poachers, and starving orphans is what they get, and they don't get that many. So you can't just go, halfway, 150, 170 years through this reign, they'd be at the halfway point of 5,000. No. It's influenced by their political context, so I'm going to need to go through that. Second factor that didn't really occur to me consciously until I was making this report, so I had to rewrite it. I know this is stupid, just you make these mental assumptions that... It's not that I treated this as, well, of course this, just I didn't think about it. They're not a breeding population. It's a military order based on recruitment. So even when you think, well, they had a surge then, but yeah, that would wear off over time. I'm thinking of like when you're playing colonization games. In video games, when you have a population of 10,000, and if the conditions are bad, they're declining to 5,000, it takes some time. You don't think of this consciously, that when, wait a minute, like, they would decline within a generation. It's how long it takes those recruits to age out of service when they're too old to fight anymore. So it's a lot faster than my mental assumptions were. So let's say the maximum age of a Night's Watch recruit, when they're still capable of able-bodied service, is 60 years. I mean, in terms of fighting or heavy labor or something, obviously you can still be a maester or even a steward, but real able-bodied service is maybe when you're 60. Well, then, like a lord who's a trained knight and military commander who can administrate things, who's exiled there after a rebellion, who's sent there when he's 40, might have like 20 years of good service in him. But a regular soldier, a trained man-at-arms, or even a trained young knight, who's sent to the Night's Watch after losing a war when he's like 20-ish, could last there maybe 40 years. So a big Civil War generation it generates a troop surge at the Night's Watch that lasts maybe 20 to 40 years. And if there isn't another major war, you'll have this sharp drop-off when they start dying of old age. Case in point, Robert's Rebellion. 17 years before the start of the story, and it said a lot of the men currently at the Wall are still Targaryen loyalists who were sent there 17 years ago, who fought for Rhaegar Targaryen. It's the hilarity of... And that's the thing I'm going to wonder when the books do this reveal the right way. If the Wall finds out that Jon Snow is really Rhaegar's son, a sizable number of the older men in the Watch fought for his father. You wonder the impact of that. Like Alliser Thorne, the Master-at-Arms of Castle Black, who I think will have an entirely different fate in the story just because he isn't at Castle Black when Jon Snow's mutiny happens. That's other characters. He's going to do something else. We're not sure what the book version of Alliser is going to do. But Alliser Thorne, the Master-at-Arms who's doing the training of the recruits, he's 50 years old when Jon gets there, and he's a former Targaryen loyalist. And at 50 years old, he's grizzled, but he's experienced, this older but more experienced, capable fighter. He's a capable ranger still at age 50. And minus 17 years, he was sent there when he was 33 at the end of Robert's Rebellion. And just that blew my mind when you think about it. Even though they're openly begging Tyrion, tell your sister, the queen, we are in a terrible state here. We only man 3 castles. We can't maintain anything anymore because there's barely 1,000 of us left. We're low on manpower. They haven't exhausted the troop surge they got from Robert's Rebellion yet. Like, they're in the back half of it. It's been almost 20 years, but, they have a decent number of men who are, 40 to 50 who fought in Robert's Rebellion who were still capable fighters. Then it would be another 20 years after that they'd hit their even lower numbers when those men like Thorne are dying off of old age. Which is really surprising that it must be lower during a really long time of peace. Now, I ran the numbers once on this. I have a whole separate video which I was actually really excited about and will come up again about the military history of all of this, of why are the army numbers so low at the Dance of the Dragons. I made it right before the Season 1 premiere. And I realize the numbers in Fire and Blood are for trained soldiers, and they mention in passing that, and they had 3 times as many mercenaries and feudal levies. So you realize that there's more men, they just don't count the rabble. But Martin was actually consistent about this. It's just you have to pay attention when he mentions army numbers. So I went back and forth about their military history in this, but if you remember that video, tell me if you do. I made a chart where I realized, since the first Blackfire Rebellion, which is after the dance, it's in the year 196 after Conquest, since the Blackfire Rebellion until 100 years later by Jon Snow's time, the Seven Kingdoms have never gone 20 to 30 years without a major civil war or rebellion. That there's never been a point where war was beyond living memory, a major war. Some are bigger than others, obviously. They say the first Blackfire Rebellion was the biggest war between the Dance of the Dragons and Robert's Rebellion, okay? So, Dance of the Dragons was around 130 after Conquest. The first Blackfire Rebellion, which was the biggest one, was 196. And Robert's Rebellion was around 280, 281 after Conquest. Started 282 after Conquest. That's the TV show pushed it back a little. But if you go through all the dates from that, well, the second rebellion was more of a failed plot, but the next big one was the third Blackfire Rebellion. That was in 219 after Conquest. So, 23, 24 years after the first one. And, the fourth one wasn't really big. It didn't get past Macy's Hook. The War of the Ninepenny Kings, would they offer some defeated knights who surrender? I mean, it's fighting in the Stepstones, but that might have generated some Blackfire supporters they sent to the Wall after the fifth Blackfire Rebellion was called the War of the Ninepenny Kings. Barristan Selmy fought in that, so did Tywin. Killed Maelys the Monstrous, so that might have generated some men. So War of the Ninepenny Kings was 260 after conquest, 22 years before Robert's Rebellion. So the numbers work out that of the 3rd century post-conquest, 100 years after Game of Thrones, first Blackfire Rebellion onwards, there's never been more than 20 to 30 years without a war. So you'd be getting troop surges that would replenish just as that first wave was starting to get a little old. Well, the 40-year-old commanders you sent to the wall would be aging out, and the young men would start being 40 to 50 like Alliser Thorne. So you wouldn't really expect them to be totally less than what Jon Snow had. Fewer men than in Jon Snow's time period from the first Blackfire Rebellion onwards. Working backward from that, though, that you'd see the peaks and valleys of what were things like during the other centuries. That they started with 10,000 men at the time of the conquest. And maybe some men were exiled there during the conquest, but not many. Because Aegon the Conqueror made a big point of pardoning men when they surrendered. Like, he'd kill a few to make examples of them if they resisted. He killed Harren the Black because he resisted, but he gave him the offer to surrender first. Or the Gardeners got wiped out at the Field of Fire, the old kings of the Reach, because they resisted. But if you surrendered, he never executed anyone. Like, if you fought him militarily, you'd die, but if he caught you, he wouldn't go, okay, execution or the wall. He'd go, serve me now. Which, on the one hand, was easier for tying together a kingdom that, like, Loren Lannister survived the Field of Fire, and he raised him up as the new Lord Paramount of the Westerlands. The Starks didn't even fight, so that Torrhen Stark just got made Lord Paramount of that. So, obviously, we know that George R. R. Martin mentioned the prophecy, that Aegon was motivated by a prophecy. Very specifically, we don't know if the book versions of, like, Jaehaerys knew about it, but Martin said Aegon the Conqueror was specifically motivated by this prophecy. It's book canon. Which probably goes a long way to explaining why he always pardoned pardoned defeated lords instead of killing them or exiling them. Is he wanted to maintain their military strength because he thought the White Walkers were coming imminently. I have a whole other video on that Martin said, well, he thought it was coming in his lifetime, right until he was an old man and realized I should probably pass this on. So, the conquest itself didn't really generate a big recruitment surge. Nor did the First Dornish War, which actually was heavy, bitter fighting. When they tried to take over Dorne, they were immediately thrown out. It was guerrilla warfare. Neither side really lost. I mean, the Targaryens were repulsed from an invasion. That doesn't produce defeated lords and armies who you send to the wall. The Targaryen armies were defeated or killed or ransomed, but they're not, go to the wall. And the Dornish they survived, they lost a lot of people, so nothing in Aegon the Conqueror's reign really would have generated that. Even taking the Iron Islands, he just raised up the Greyjoy, asked them to raise up their own, they raised up the Greyjoys. Aegon ruled 37 years until he died as an old man, and that's roughly 40 years, 37, 40. And by the end of that, I think the last 7 years or so, they said he was old enough he wasn't making royal progresses anymore. He'd stopped visiting Winterfell. You can kind of see how Aegon the Conqueror himself wouldn't notice the decline of the Night's Watch, because it wouldn't happen for like the first 20 years. It takes time for men to age out. But by the time they were dropping like flies because they were dying because of old age, he wasn't visiting it anymore. He was told to really go north again. By 37 after conquest, they were probably in a pretty bad state of decline, but Aegon was old, dying, and not really much of a state to do anything about it. The point of all this is I realized there's these sharp, sudden surges for a generation, like 20 to 40 years after a major war, that drop off to zero after 20 to 40 years. It's surprising how quickly they flatline after that on the scale of a century. What happened after Aegon died? Well, his first son Aenys was a weakling, and then his second son Maegor the Cruel was a tyrant who usurped the throne. So the next big war was the Faith Militant uprising against his sons, mostly against Maegor. Aenys died early on. There were like pop-up rebellions against Aenys, but they just say Maegor executed the rebels at the Eyrie, or the Ironborn put down the Lotus's rebellion and executed everyone. There is no mention of people being sent to the Wall at that point in time. So from the initial conquest up until the end of the Faith Militant uprising and the death of Maegor in the year 48 after conquest, there was no troop surge. There was in the aftermath of Maegor, because he was succeeded by his brother's son, Jaehaerys. Maegor had usurped his brother's children. The rightful heir returned, as they say. Jaehaerys came and led a final rebellion against him. There wasn't even fighting. At that point, everyone just abandoned Maegor because he was such a crazy person. And then he died as they were advancing on the city. So Maegor had exiled a lot of Faith Militant to the Wall, particularly the warrior sons, the upper class, the upper order that's composed of knights. Like when he took Old Town through trickery from the High Towers, they sent quite a few, a couple, like 200 guys up to the Wall from the Faith Militant. But then when Maegor was overthrown, various Maegor loyalists were sent to the Wall as well, like his two former Kingsguard, and there were four of them actually. But Jaehaerys is a moderate. He's in the middle of those two extremes. You have the Faith Militant on one side who want to throw out all Targaryens, and at the other extreme you have Maegor Targaryen the Tyrant. In the middle was Jaehaerys, called Jaehaerys the Conciliator, who reconciled with the Faith, said, look, disband your military orders and I'll grant everyone an amnesty. That's what happened. There was a troop surge after Jaehaerys took over, after Maegor died and the Faith Militant uprising ended. There was a troop surge to the Wall, which was totally squandered by a rebellion in the Night's Watch. That they had all of these new men from both the Faith Militant and Maegor loyalists. And because they're experienced knights, the Lord Commander of the Night's Watch put these Maegor loyalists in charge of Newcastle garrisons staffed by Faith Militant, and maybe he thought that they'd be at odds with each other, and playing them off against each other would keep them in line or something, I don't know. But they realized, politics, strange bedfellows, both groups hated Jaehaerys' new regime. So they made common cause, and there was this large-scale rebellion within the Night's Watch in the 2 years after Jaehaerys came to power, year 50 after conquest. That these garrisons at Sable Hall and Rhynegate, led by Maegor's Kingsguard over new staffs of Faith Militant exiles, they rebelled and tried to set themselves up as their own lords. And they said like a tenth of the Night's Watch rebelled, but for every one man who rebelled, 10 remained loyal. And it got so bad that the Lord Stark had to lead an army to put the rebellion down. And this is important for us because it's really the only time the Starks would come into the story in pretty much the first half of Fire and Blood. If they make a Targaryen conquest show, which I've said should last like 5 seasons, after Torrhen Stark appears in like the first season, there's not even real fighting. After Aegon is crowned, you wouldn't see Starks again, because they're aloof from politics. They're just up in the north, they don't really care. The only other basically cameo you'd get from the Starks or the Night's Watch in a Targaryen conquest show is like the final season, like season 5, after Maegor dies, show this Night's Watch rebellion from all the Faith Militant and Maegor loyalists sent there, and they have to put it down. So the troop surge was squandered, they lost a lot of men, and 8 years after that, year 58 after conquest, Jaehaerys and Alysanne made a royal progress to Winterfell. And Alysanne felt like, hey, I'm here, I'm riding my dragon, I might as well take a day trip to the Wall, to Castle Black, to inspect everything, because we haven't done that in a long time. So consider that, like, the last royal progress Aegon the Conqueror made might have been, like, 28 after conquest. It's like the first time a Targaryen was there in 30 years. And they'd gone through this total numbers decline since the conquest, from the recruitment drying up. Any surge they got from the Faith Militant Uprising and Maegor's wars, that was squandered in the rebellion. And this actually is quite a long episode in Fire and Blood. The new Jaehaerys chapters that Martin wrote it out of order. He wrote these things as like mini novellas. And when he combined them for Fire and Blood, he said he was writing these new linker chapters to cover the reign of Jaehaerys, which take up the second quarter of the book. They're actually pretty extensive, but we're happy to have them to bridge the gap. So chronologically, this is the last thing that Martin has written, that he wrote in like early 2018. He wrote these new Jaehaerys chapters, including this incident with Alysanne tries to fly her dragon over the wall, and it can't. It's like it's hitting an invisible barrier. That there's like a barrier against magical creatures going through it. You can take a wight through it, but it can't go on its own. That I hope we see that in season 2 with Jace, that a dragon won't fly over the wall. It's like this force field is keeping them away. But anyways, it's a big, extensive part of Fire and Blood. It is from the main novels. They do say Jaehaerys, Alysanne flew north and did an inspection tour and decided they need a lot more funding. So this is mentioned in the Bran chapters in the main novels when they get there. But it's given even more expansion in the new chapters for Fire and Blood of what happened when they got there, that Alysanne toured it. She went to Castle Black, then went slightly west to the Night Fort, which had been their first castle and original headquarters since the Long Night, 8,000 years ago, but it was too big to maintain. They don't give a number of men at that point in time, just it was drastically low. And my theory is if they squandered all that troop surge in the rebellion, the number of men could have dropped down to less than 1,000 by the time Aegon the Conqueror died. Or like by Maegor's time, because by the death of Aenys, by the crowning of Maegor, by like the year 44 after Conquest or something, anyone who was in the Watch in the year 1 would have died off from old age, and there weren't any new wars sending men there. That's when the crunch would have come. Around the 40s. But the 40s is when Aenys was having trouble, when Maegor's having trouble. Faith Militant Uprising didn't send more. Any men they sent got squandered. Oh, and by the way, I don't have time to go into this in great detail or with artwork or anything, but please check out this great video by World of Westeros on the Night's Watch Rebellion of 50 AC, where they sent all these guys from the Faith Militant Uprising and Maegor Loyalists, and how they all got wiped out in a rebellion, so it didn't really help them in any way, the one major war between the Conquest and the Dance. Please check that video out. I'm going to link it in the description box below and at the end of the video. He does a nice, more succinct thing with actual artwork going, this is the one big incident the Night's Watch has in the story, in the books at least, between the Conquest and the Dance. But this brings us to when Alysanne and Jaehaerys visited the north, and Alysanne convinced Jaehaerys, I flew my dragon there, I toured everything, they're actually in a pretty bad state up there. And this is like the first time in 50 years, they after this 50-year decline, they realized how bad things had gotten. And Jaehaerys became this great patron of the Night's Watch. They still really respect him, there's statues and stuff of him and Alysanne, they realized we can't send more men because there aren't wars, but we can give you a lot of funding. And this is starting in year 58 after Conquest. Jaehaerys made the unprecedented step of doubling the size of the gift. The land south of the wall gifted to the Night's Watch when it was built. This is where they get their food. This is where they grow their crops. That is the biggest land donation they've ever gotten in 8,000 years of their history. And he doubled it at a time where they were having a manpower shortage. Now, the land itself is worked by peasants who worked for the feudal lords in the north, like the Umbers before that. There's people generating food and stuff. It's, why do they need this many supplies for their dwindling in number? Because he thought the White Walkers might come back, but he granted them, he doubled their land size, and in a feudal society, land is everything. A land donation is bigger than money. And he also gave them huge infusions of gold, regular donations of money. And another big thing is Alysanne convinced the Night's Watch to shut down their original headquarters, the Night Fort. When she visited it, that it's obviously this thing is it is too big to maintain anymore. That you need 10 times the men you have now to staff it fully and do repairs and stuff. So it's crumbling into ruin because you have a skeleton force manning it. It's too big. It's crumbling. We can't send you more men. You might as well shut it down, which ties into other theories about mysterious sacrifices going on at the Night Fort and stuff, but on the surface at least, it's too big to maintain, we can't send enough men. Alysanne convinced them, shut down the Night Fort, and I will personally sell my own jewels to personally raise the money to buy another one, to fund the construction of a replacement, a smaller but newer replacement right next to it, called Deep Lake, because it was near a lake. So they replaced the night. How many times did they build a new fort on the wall? They never mentioned the times the other ones were built. They just said Night Fort was the first one. They weren't all built at the same time. But that might be the most recent, newest castle along the wall is Deep Lake. So she sold her personal jewelry to pay for it, to make sure it's nice and well manned. Jaehaerys himself hired the builders from the Free Cities to build it. It took 8 years, so that would mean it would be done around 66, 67 after Conquest. By the Dance of the Dragons, this thing is like a little less than 70 years old. I don't think they'd abandon Deep Lake. Like, if you're going to abandon a castle, you abandon one of the older, crumbling ones. This one is 70s, in terms of a house, in terms of a structure. Compared to these other ones hundreds of years old, that's still structurally sound. I think that's one of the last ones you'd abandon. So they built new forts. They gave them large infusions of money, and biggest of all, they made a giant land donation. They forced the Stark's vassals to donate their northern lands to them. And I've said in other videos, I hope that comes up in Season 2, mentioning the new gift land deal, which the Starks were annoyed about. This is like the one time, after the Faith Militant thing, the one time they come in royal court affairs, actually, because that rebellion was up in the north. This is like they're apolitical farmers up in the north and shepherds who never get involved in the royal court. And suddenly this is the one time the Starks took a controversial position, is they were one of the few houses that voted for the Velaryons at the Great Council. Well, in the books it was Laenor. The TV show made it Rhaenys because they changed the character ages. It's fine. It was between Rhaenys' bloodline and Viserys' bloodline. So Season 2 of the TV version, they'll say, oh yeah, we voted for Rhaenys instead of Viserys. And the Maester writing the History in the World book says, we think it's because they were still bitter with Jaehaerys about forcing them to grant this land to the Night's Watch. So it was publicly Viserys was his preferred candidate. So they voted against his favorite candidate because they were angry at him. They said, well, then we'll vote for Rhaenys. And they were one of only 2 great houses who voted for her, on top of the fact that, like, barely 50 houses, like 1 out of 20 voted for her. Only 2 great houses. The other one was the Baratheons, but that's because Rhaenys' mother was a Baratheon. She's half Baratheon. So there's this unusual thing of, oh yeah, and the Starks voted for you guys. What? We never contacted them. They're angry at Jaehaerys about this. And it's this whole thing that the Starks explained, we're already giving the surplus from these lands in terms of food and taxes. We just give those supplies and money to the Night's Watch anyway. We're regular donors. The reason they were angry is they said, our feudal lords, like the Umbers, the Mountain Clans, like the Flints, they can administer those lands better than the Night's Watch, whose attention will always be on threats from the north, not on administering these things. That we're already giving them everything from these lands, that we can do it better and just give what they need to it. And that's actually a thing from the first book. Like, one of the last things Ned Stark did right before he left was he realized all these rumors of Mance Rayder raising an army. The Watch was in such a bad state that he was going to suggest to Mormont, Commander Mormont, maybe you should not give lands of the gift back to us, but can our feudal lords take over the day-to-day running of that and we'll just pay you the taxes we generate from them? Which was functionally ruling over just, and we'll promise to pay you the money. But the watching, you see again, when Mormont meets Tyrion, they're practically begging for help. Ned thought that they would agree to that because they need the help. That things were so bad. So even Ned was like, this didn't work, giving the gift to the Night's Watch that much land that they couldn't defend well. Wildling raids drove everyone off. That there used to be a lot more people living in the gift. Remember the TV show when Bran goes through it, and they come across a ruined town, and then they run into Jon Snow, Ygritte, and Tormund's group of wildlings coming south? That town is actually called Queen's Crown, the one with the mill in it, the windmill. And it's the ruins of Queen's Crown because it was an active town at the time that Alysanne visited the Wall. She passed through there. And they renamed the town Queen's Crown because a queen stayed there exactly one night, and they were really proud of it. And we don't have a clear timeline, but just at some point between when she visited in like 58, year 58, and 240 years later when Bran and Jon were there, it fell into ruin because everyone fled from all the wildling raids. The Night's Watch couldn't administer it well. They couldn't even defend it well because it's too far away. Molestown is still around because it's like a few miles south of the Wall, and the wildlings weren't stupid enough to attack a town that close to Castle Black. Little raiding parties, but the farther away that you gave them more lands farther away from the Wall, none of their defenses are in the gift. They wouldn't know how to defend it from wildlings sailing boats around the Wall for raids and stuff. So that's another thing that would change is over time. I'm getting ahead of myself of just there actually were more lands in it and people in it at first. So Jaehaerys was giving them an unprecedented amount of money. He was even giving them lands, to the consternation of the Starks. He was funding construction of new forts. That's how much funding and support and supplies they were getting. So their numbers could have dropped off to less than 1,000. If at the time of Robert's Rebellion they had barely 1,000 from their normal supply of thieves and orphans and stuff, but they had 1,000, including that they hadn't exhausted their recruitment wave from Robert's Rebellion yet. So if in Season 2 they say, if in House of the Dragon Season 2 they say we only have 500 men, I would consider that a reasonable number. Maybe more like 700 or something, but just, we don't even have a surge from something like Robert's Rebellion. We're coming off an 80-year era of peace. There haven't been wars in 80 years. Any surge we got then, they would have died off anyway, that there would have needed to be a major war like 40 years before the Dance of the Dragons to really produce any effect. Even if those men hadn't rebelled, they would have died off in by the 90s AC, the 90s after Conquest, when Jaehaerys was an old man, like around the time Rhaenys' father Aemon died, around 92, you wouldn't see any of those men left. They've just died of old age. And it's even later than that, so they might have as few as 500, 700, it's going to be below 1,000, but they're incredibly well funded. I mean, think about it. Like, what is their normal level of money funding? Not people, but money. The northern houses who get attacked by wildlings donate them surplus taxes and food. The independent kingdom of the north would supply them. But the rest of the kingdoms wouldn't. I mean, if you're like the third son of a lord from the Vale, like Waymar Royce was, you see in the beginning, Waymar was a minor third son of a powerful nobleman, so they probably sent him with good equipment and maybe even an initial money donation. But apart from a third son being sent with a decent purse full of money or something, there weren't like governments giving them money other than the Starks. Then when you have this Targaryen super kingdom that united the 7 kingdoms, well, 6 of them, except for Dorne, suddenly you're getting like public works like the King's Road from King's Landing to Winterfell to the Wall. Suddenly there is a good quality highway running from Winterfell to Castle Black. So if and when there is a wildling invasion, they had a few like under Raymond Redbeard, that happened later, but the Starks can rush armies there if there's a major wildling incursion. They could actually get through the gift a little faster in the middle, at least, that they had highways, that the amount of funding you need to build an entirely new castle after the Long Night, when it was an extinction level war where they devoted generations worth of work into building the damn thing. But after that, I mean, the thousands of years since, no one was making giant donations to them like that. From now you've got tax money from the Targaryen vassals in the Reach, from the Vale serving under the Targaryens are paying tax money, which a fraction of which is going to the Night's Watch. That Jaehaerys is giving them money from his Westeros-wide taxes and all their money and their prosperity from this unprecedented era of peace is being funneled into these mega projects like the highway projects, or they would be getting a decent amount of tax money from Jaehaerys, from the entire realm as a whole. Aegon didn't realize that the decline was happening because it would only happen when he was an old man. Aenys and Maegor had bigger problems, but by the time there was a monarch who noticed this, Jaehaerys was devoting a significant amount of money and funds to them. Which, of course, brings up the TV revelation that they were passing down this warning about the White Walker threat, or maybe if they didn't know it was White Walkers, some threat from beyond the wall. That was probably motivating Jaehaerys. That's why he gave them farmlands in the new gift that they didn't need because they didn't have that many men. Well, maybe they thought in terms of generating tax money, but we have more food than we know what to do with. Is there going to be an army stationed here soon? That's what Jaehaerys might have thought, but Jaehaerys was probably motivated by he thought the White Walkers would come back. And while the show didn't touch on this in Season 1, the TV show did establish that Viserys knew about this prophecy. It was passed down to him from Jaehaerys' time back through Aegon the Conqueror, and that he took this prophecy very seriously. So, do you actually think, just logically, putting two and two together here, that TV Viserys wouldn't continue his grandfather Jaehaerys' policy of sending heavy funding to the Night's Watch? That given how much he was focused on, there's a threat coming from beyond the wall, there's a threat coming from beyond the wall, you think he wouldn't continue Jaehaerys' policy of giving them a lot of tax money? Regular infusions of gold. I mean, there's only so many forts you can build. That's a major project, and you can't double the size of the gift every generation. That's a bit much. But, regular infusions of gold. The way he was in the books, he actually regularly sent gold to Daemon and Corlys and the Stepstones, just so they wouldn't lose, just to keep them fighting in the Stepstones against the Triarchy. And he'd say, let them play at war. It keeps them out of trouble. That they're in this, I'll fund you to stay in the Stepstones playing at war with pirates. So they're 80 years of prosperity. Viserys is the height of the Targaryen reign. They have this huge economic surplus in the royal treasury. You really think he wouldn't be giving regular donations? So what I'm building to is I'm expecting that in Season 2, one of the Night's Watch members we see remarks, oh yeah, Jace, your grandsire Viserys was giving us regular, generous donations of gold, continuing the donation policy of his grandsire Jaehaerys, who was always a great friend of the Night's Watch. So was Viserys. He would regularly donate us money. Something like that. This was happening in the background, I think is logical, that if he was that worried about it, Viserys would be concerned with the state of the Night's Watch. So they probably have a lot of funding, which they presumably stopped getting after the Dance of the Dragons when the knowledge of the prophecy was lost. Like, by the time of Aegon the Unworthy, by the time of even Daeron II, Daeron the Good, by the time of the Blackfire Rebellions, apparently, the prophecy had been lost to history. They wouldn't have been funding the Watch as much. I mean, the most they eventually did was, okay, again, when you send a younger son to the wall, you send them with money. When they sent Bloodraven along with the Raven's Teeth to the wall, they probably got an infusion of cash, but it wasn't a regular thing. But these early kings, Aegon didn't realize it was a problem. His sons didn't were had their own screw ups. But from Jaehaerys through Viserys, within the TV canon, which is basically what the books are doing, you'd expect through logical deduction, Jaehaerys and Viserys would be very concerned with funding the Night's Watch because both men were deeply influenced by that prophecy. So we will be seeing them. I'm extrapolating all this from some 20 seconds of good footage we had of. They have really good costumes, and they have really good quality gear and matching horses and stuff. So I think that's what we'd see. One other suggestion I have, and this is stupid and they're probably not going to do it, but I was rereading through all of this. And in A Dance with Dragons, Book 5, Jon Snow is trying to figure out how to administer the Watch now that he's in charge of it, preparing for the White Walker assault. And this is what makes Martin's world feel so grounded, that I love that stuff that isn't just fight scene, fight scene, fight scene, but him trying to plan out, okay, we can send a skeleton force of mixed wildlings and Night's Watch survivors to re-garrison Icemark. We'll send those guys to re-garrison that other fort. That he's trying to make this work, as he's essentially ruling a tiny mini kingdom over the Watch and over the Wall and the Gift, and he realizes they can't survive winter on the provisions they have. Like they can survive like a year or two on the food they have, but not. Plus, with all the wildlings they took in, that if winter lasts 10 years, assuming the White Walkers don't get to the Wall first, it will starve. So there's a chapter where, remember, Tycho Nestoris comes to the Wall looking for Stannis, then goes south to find Stannis, and eventually does in one of the preview chapters for Book 6. But Jon he signs a formal agreement with this Tycho of the Iron Bank to take out a big loan so the Watch can just buy food to survive. Basic food stuff, just grain, whatever. Not like, oh, fine venison and fresh vegetables. It's just, we'll buy grain so we don't starve. And Jon does remark in this in his head. I don't have time to put all the quotes up here, but check for the chapter where he's talking with Tycho Nestoris. He goes, if we survive this, it'll be like a generation before we pay off this loan. But what choice do I have? It's that or starve. Like, this isn't one of the things that, like, Bowen Marsh and the other commanders eventually turn on him for. It's, well, do you have a suggestion for how else we're going to get food, other than taking out a big loan? That's really what we have to do now. And it's like this scene where I love how Martin does this, where characters will speculate on, maybe I could do this. They're trying to put together a plan. Like someone in a prologue chapter is thinking, I'm going to do this, I'll be able to cross that bridge and survive, then they get suddenly killed or something. Or like, I'm thinking like when Asha Greyjoy is at Deepwood Mott, and she's trying to think of what her next move should be, but gets interrupted by the surprise assault of the Northern Mountain clans that have sided with Stannis. But this is what's realistic. People don't know what's coming, that they have plans in motion that get interrupted. That there's this scene after taking out this big loan where Jon is like riding the elevator up the Wall and looking out over everything, and he's just that one of those idle moments speculating. He's like, wow, what would I do if I actually had real coin to buy things for the Night's Watch to improve things? What would I buy if I had money? Not just, here's some sacks of grain so you don't starve, but like good quality stuff. Like obviously the men dressed in rags would get good winter clothing. There's this point where he idly speculates, if I had a real surplus of gold, I would hire glassmakers from Myr to make greenhouses, like they have at Winterfell. The TV show never depicted this. I wish they had. That how do they survive winters that can last 3 to 5 years, sometimes 10 years? Well, they store a lot of grain, and for fresh vegetables and stuff, so they don't get rickets and things, they have a lot of greenhouses throughout Westeros, and they mention them at Winterfell. So it's this little thing where he goes it would be nice if we had greenhouses like real castles do, which have lordships. But he realizes, that's way too expensive. I'm taking out massive loans just to get a sack of flour. That'll never happen. And you think that's probably why, when you go, oh, well, this is the free city that makes all the wine. This is the one that makes all the timber, like Quohor. This is the one that makes all of the tapestries in Norvos. That you go, oh, Mir, they're famous for their glasswork. That's actually really important in a world where they heavily rely on greenhouses to survive the winter. So the point is, he goes, if the watch was actually well funded under me, I'd build some greenhouses. That's a practical thing that everyone could get behind that we actually need. Not just, oh, we'd be buying like luxuries and things as lords. It's, we need greenhouses to get fresh produce during winter. And then he laughs off, oh yeah, I'm in debt now, but spend a long time talking about this. That's something I think you could quickly show in season 2. And I hope they do. They're probably not going to. But, Ryan Condal's read the books pretty thoroughly, and when he makes references to things from the main novels that they've kind of imported into the prequel stuff, I'd like to see, oh, and here's the glass greenhouse for Castle Black. Here's our fresh vegetables. Just a little thing for like 30 seconds. It would tell you so much about how well funded they are, even if their manpower is low, that we have greenhouses. And of course, obviously, I think the thing they will do is just show Castle Black in a better state of repair, where, the way they showed it is there's old wood bridges and walls that are the old wood that's really warped with age, and there's nails sticking out everywhere, that it would look like it was relatively fresh. It's an old castle, but like any wood that wore out was quickly replaced. They could afford it. That nothing looked particularly worn out because they were keeping it in a good state. They could afford to keep it in a good state of repair. That just, obviously the writers had problems, but it breaks my heart that they had like top tier set designers and costumers from other HBO things and other projects working on this show and developing the look and feel of it in season 1. And the showrunners weren't really responsible for that. It's the thought that went into the set design that Castle Black, which was a fully realized 360 set that they had in a quarry, looks like this run-down penal colony fort at the northern edge of the world. They really got the visual look right. And imagine what Castle Black looks like when it's well-funded, where half of the recruits are not thieves and orphans and poachers, but we're generally the third sons like Waymar Royce who went there. That they're not down to just that level of guys. There's always a trickle of poachers and stuff, but they're well-funded, and they can manage to do that. I mentioned that briefly in the first report video I made, that just for the costuming, it really hit me when like Michelle Clapton explained the poor ones who were poachers and rapers and thieves, they just came wearing summer clothing, and they dyed it black. That's all they could do. But they are not wearing cold weather clothing. They will freeze in winter. There aren't enough furs to go around. That when you look at the poorer ones, we're focused more on the ones who are well-funded, like Jon Snow, Samwell Tarly, Jorah Mormont, were noblemen's sons or former lords, but the really poor recruits are not wearing adequate clothing at all. When you look back at the design, instead in this they're wearing uniforms and stuff. What are other things they could do to show their funding is really high despite the manpower shortage? That money isn't really a problem for them. So I said the first 2 sections were the manpower things and the funding levels. And how far am I along in this? Okay, I'm about a full hour in here. One other thing is, like I said, from the Blackfire Rebellion onwards, they'd at least be getting infusions of men every 20 to 30 years from a war. By the Dance of the Dragons, they're at least well-funded, but they haven't had a troop surge since, like, the time of the conquest itself, except for that rebellion that fizzled out. They're not going to spoilers. They got a decent number of people sent to the Watch in the aftermath of the Dance of the Dragons. But, because apparently the prophecy was lost, they stopped sending them regular funding the way Jaehaerys would, or even Viserys would. Were there troop surges from other wars after that, from around 133 after Conquest to First Blackfire was 196, so think we're talking a period of about 60 to 65 years. Were there wars in there? Well, there was the Conquest of Dorne, which was, well, the actual war lasted 1 year, then there was a protracted insurgency from 157 to 161. But unlike the First Dornish War, I mean, where the Dornish were never conquered, they initially conquered them. So I can see a wave of Dornish knights being sent to the wall in the immediate aftermath of the conquest of Dorne, before they went into insurgency mode. And the Regency era had its share of civil wars in the aftermath of the dance, and the shenanigans Aegon IV got up to, Aegon the Unworthy probably sent a decent number of men to the wall, so there were peaks and valleys in there, and they didn't have good funding, but they never had a period where they went 80 years without a war again. This was longer. This is like aftermath of the dance to the Conquest of Dorne is like 20 years, and from Conquest of Dorne to First Blackfyre is about 40 years. That's a long time, so like, with no more Targaryen funding and no men in 40 years, at the end of Aegon the Unworthy's reign, when Daeron the Good came to power, the Blackfyre Rebellion didn't happen immediately, that he was in power for a while. At the beginning of Daeron the Good's reign, I think the Night's Watch was probably in a pretty bad state, from which they eventually, things evened out again. I mean, eventually there was even an invasion by a king beyond the wall, Raymond Redbeard, but that was in the early 200s, but that was in the time of they said, the time of Jon Snow's grandfather's grandfather. Anyway, I've covered manpower levels, and I've covered funding levels. Last section I have here, and the shortest, is which castles are still manned by this halfway point in the Targaryen dynasty. Because by Jon Snow's time, they had contracted to just 3. Castle Black in the middle, Eastwatch by the Sea, which is their main port on the right-hand side, and on the west end is the Shadow Tower, where it ends in a mountain gorge. But assuming they had their maximum number of castles at the time of the conquest, and they might have abandoned some by then already, it's hard to say, how many were around by this midpoint? So I checked through all the texts, I checked every wiki article on every castle, just any shred of stray mention of things. And they only mention maybe 3 or 4 of them, and I've included all this here. That we never hear of, like, Sable Hall and Rhymegate again after that rebellion was put down, after the rebellion to the end of the Faith Militant Uprising. They might never have been regarrisoned after they were stormed. And the only ones that we really hear about are actually in the middle, and they're all 4 in a row, from Castle Black to the Night Fort in the west. That when Alysanne went to the Night Fort from Castle Black proceeding west, she went through Snowgate, which was then renamed Queensgate in her honor. And then between Queensgate and the Night Fort, they built the Night Fort's replacement, Deep Lake. Queensgate is mentioned again in the Regency era in the aftermath of the Dance of the Dragons. It's the only other castle that's really mentioned in Fire and Blood at all after that, really. That the wildling horde under Silas the Grim they forced a passage through Queensgate in the Regency era. That's something to look forward to, and maybe I hope they'll name drop that in season 2. It'll be setting up something for, like I said, if they do a Regency show, it'd be the equivalent of season 6. I think they're negotiating 5 seasons on a Dance of the Dragons show. The Regency is a direct sequel. So like season 1 of a Regency show would have a wildling invasion of the north, because it gives Cregan Stark something to do. That he has a long life where he has many adventures, one of which is, well, in the aftermath of the war, there's a bad winter, there's a plague, and their manpower is so used up that Cregan survives, but they have hardly any men left, and the wildlings realize their weakness, so this warband leader, Silas the Grim, leads 3,000 men, force their way through Queensgate. And he's not a full king beyond the wall, but he's got like an army of 3,000 warriors at a time when the north is just devastated by all the disease, the winter. Everything's pretty bad there. So Cregan has to rally what men he can to fight them off. People want to have Starks and Lannisters as main characters. The Lannisters are doing stuff in the Small Council, that's part, and Joanna's doing stuff in Casterly Rock. She has a big storyline, actually, but How would we keep the Starks in a story about the Regency? Just if, I know it's a big if, they make a Regency show, one of the top questions is, what is there for the Starks to do? Set up Cregan fighting off a wildling invasion. So I hope that season 2 of this name drops. They wouldn't cast him or anything, but name drop, oh yeah, the wildling war chieftain Silas the Grim has been giving us a lot of trouble. To set him up for like 5 years from now when they actually cast him for something, for a sequel show or something. It'd be something, one line. One line is all I ask, just to set that up. So, I don't know if Queen's Gate was abandoned after Silas attacked, but at least at the beginning of the Dance of the Dragons, Queen's Gate is actually still manned. That is very clear. And as I said, I think Deep Lake would be one of the last ones they abandon as well, because if you're pulling back because of manpower, one of the last ones you abandon is the fresh, in terms of buildings, 70 years compared to, that crumbling 500,000-year-old building. The 70-year-old relatively new castle is one of the last ones you abandon. Because if you have to cut the manpower, you cut the builders, and the orders are the rangers, the builders. You could man it with just rangers for a while if you don't have enough builders to go around. So, look, obviously when they visit the wall in Season 2, they're not going to go to a castle no one has ever heard of. They're going to go to Castle Black because it's a familiar location that the audience wants to see. Or, on top of it, it's their headquarters. Why would you go to a different fort? But maybe if they mention in dialogue is what I'm talking about. I want them to mention something like, the garrison commander at Queensgate just wrote me this letter and he's increasing his patrols. Like the way we didn't see Eastwatch and the Shadow Tower in Season 1, but Jorah Mormont would mention letters he got from, these aren't the only... There was a scene where he said, these aren't the only whites we found. The zombies, he said, Cotter Pike at Eastwatch said he also found there were some there too. Like, something in dialogue like that, mention that Queensgate is still around. Setting up that it's called Queensgate because of Alisan and the Night Fort stuff. I wonder if we'd actually see the ruins of the Night Fort again. Which we did see in Season 4, when Sam and Bran were there, and they actually mention... I know from Wiki stuff, that is the one time that the name Jaehaerys was mentioned in Game of Thrones in dialogue, not the animated stuff. Is when they get in sight of it, Samwell explains to Gilly, it was abandoned in the time of King Jaehaerys, but there's a secret gate that I should be able to find that I read about in a book that I know how to find the secret gate, so we should be able to pass through there, and no one will follow us because they're not expecting us to go through the secret passage. And it works. And that's the whole thing from the book they shouldn't have cut, which I will be talking about in my next video about, the history of the Night's Watch, the Night King and the White Walkers and everything going on at the Night Fort. But be that as it may, I hope they start mentioning that a lot of crazy stuff went down at the Night Fort. But this is asking too much. I'm getting too greedy. Like 2 months ago we were like, hey, wouldn't it be crazy if the Night's Watch has an invented subplot? And now we're like, I'm trying to throw all sorts of things into it. Like, I'm not trying to make clickbait here on... Someone genuinely asked me, Red Team Review asked me, I heard a rumor that Jace will see a White Walker. And I'll tell you that I know I am on Discords with other spy communities. Like, I'm on the same spy Discord that Redanian Intelligence is, and asking around about the whole community, like them, House of the Dragon, Croatia, we have not heard a rumor like that whatsoever. I can't disprove it, I can't prove a negative, but we have heard no rumors of White Walkers actually appearing on screen. But they don't need to appear on screen. I mean, like, when Jon Snow was at Craster's Keep in Season 2, you never actually saw the White Walkers, but it was their storyline of how people are reacting to them off screen and stuff. So, rumors coming to the Night's Watch of foul movements in the haunted forest, I don't know. This is all getting ahead of ourselves, but just, hey, it would be nice if when they visit Castle Black, they mention, hey, I got a letter from the commander at Queensgate about something. One other thing, that I zoomed in on the map here to show these 4 castles because they're in a row, but one other one is a little farther west, is Greyguard. Not mentioned again in Fire and Blood, just the only other one out of all of these 19 castles that any timeline of when it was abandoned is Greyguard is the castle, the abandoned castle that Jon Snow and the wildlings he's with Ygritte and Tormund, that's where they climb over the wall, is near the ruins of Greyguard. Well, ruins, it's abandoned, it's fallen into disrepair. And it's at this bend in the wall, the tree line has grown all the way up to it, so he crosses over at Greyguard. And in the book, his internal narration notes that it's been abandoned for 200 years. That is the only timeline that for any of these, 15, 16 other castles, the only timeline we get for when any of the other ones were abandoned other than the Night Fort is, Greyguard was abandoned about 200 years ago. Maybe John, you could use the excuse that he was rounding up from 170 years ago. Maybe it was still on its last legs at the outbreak of the Dance of the Dragons, that a couple of these forts could have been wiped out by the wildling invasions, like Silas the Grimm's attacks could have thinned their numbers too much. They had to abandon some of them. Or when Raymond Redbeard forced a crossing over the wall, that there's ways you can do that. So I wouldn't mind if they name drop it. They don't mention the name Greyguard in Season 3, but in Season 5 they do have the line from the book that Jon says, I'm going to send Sir Janos, I'm going to send you to re-garrison the ruins at Greyguard. And he goes, it's a ruin. He goes, yeah, I need an experienced guy to restaff it and restore it. And he goes, I'm not going to take an order from you, bastard. And he says it 3 times, so he executes him. Straight from the book that, more or less, they changed some of the dialogue. But they do mention Greyguard in dialogue like once, just because they were quoting the book at the time. But that might, and this is scraping the bottom of the barrel, that might be there. Dare we hope there's like a point where, there could be a point where the current Lord Commander, where the Night's Watch guys tell Cregan and Jace, yeah, we're down to 8 castles, and lists off the other 5 or something. I don't know. Maybe not listing them off, but just saying, oh yeah, we're down to 10 castles, just to highlight how different it is now. That would be interesting, but searching everything, the only ones mentioned by name in these prior time periods, beyond the 3 we already knew about in Jon Snow's time, are that they abandoned the Night Fort to make Deep Lake, and that Snowgate was renamed Queensgate and is still active during the dance because it was attacked during the Regency. And an obscure mention that maybe Greyguard, which was abandoned 200 years ago, might be something, but that's really all we have there. And I also, so outro here, I am looking forward to and again, this is mostly dialogue, they who's excited about seeing Molestown again, but that they pass through Queen's Crown and there's still actually people living there, because we saw the ruins of Queen's Crown in Game of Thrones. Just to emphasize, I think they should do that more than Molestown. Show Queen's Crown as they're passing through, just to show the gift hasn't been totally abandoned yet, and have someone remark on, oh yeah, Jaehaerys granted rule of these lands, including this town we're standing in now. Used to be held by the Umbers, but they gave it to the Watch, but there's a lot of wildling attacks now because the Watch can't really defend it well. For all of 30 seconds, I guess, but that might be a bit of a reach. A lot of this is just stuff they might name drop in dialogue, but I don't want to be too greedy, but I've emphasized in my other videos, if this was a tiny edition, they would have done it on green screen. If they were just, oh, let's make a field trip to the Watch, they could have done this on a virtual set. Instead, they have a fully realized set for the top of the wall, a practical set that they built at Leavesden Studios, and we're seeing a dozen mounted Night's Watch Rangers, and horses are expensive and hard to deploy, a dozen horse riders in this big on-set filming in Bourne Wood, where they used the snow dressing teams to make a snowy forest, with these Night's Watch guys going through it. This is a fairly extensive use of practical sets and location filming, which has increased my hope for maybe they're giving them quite a substantial subplot we don't really know. And so much of this would just be Easter eggs and stuff, but I'm really excited for it. The basic line, this was a freeform rant, not freeform, but I wrote my notes up. I checked the books for any mention of numbers. They don't give any, you just have to infer, wait a minute. After 40 years after a major war, a troop surge would totally wear off, because they don't reproduce. So that Jon Snow's time is still experiencing the back half of the burst they got from Robert's Rebellion. Dance of the Dragons is 80 years after they would have gotten any soldiers, more like 130 because they squandered them in that rebellion. Remember to check out World of Westeros' nice video about that rebellion. But even if they had lived, they would have exhausted it by the 90s anyway. So that they probably, like I said at the beginning, they probably have the fewest men they've ever had. Season 2 could say we're down to 700 men, and I think that would be a good estimate. They don't have as many men from Robert's Rebellion surge like that. On the other hand, they should be really well funded by Jaehaerys and Viserys. So they've got really good armor, that the castle should look like it's in a good state of repair. They might even have a greenhouse. That would be really impressive just to pick up on. This is some really big thing they have. Like, they wouldn't have, like, we have a big theme park slide, a water slide. They wouldn't have that. Or, a decorative garden, like the royal gardens at King's Landing, to show off how wealthy they are. If we had money, we'd get something useful and practical, like a greenhouse, so we have produce in winter. So I'm just thinking on what they could or couldn't do. Another thing that I noticed someone suggested this, was actually the podcast for winteriscoming.net pointed this out. Maybe it won't just be Jace and Cregan, because Jace leaves and then Cregan only comes back at the end of the story. What if, they will introduce this with Jace meeting Cregan, not in Season 2, but in subsequent seasons even. Maybe this is a giant ongoing subplot where we just see Cregan in the north, seeing the stirrings of the White Walkers coming back and stuff. That he's passing the torch, that it goes from Jace visits Cregan, they check it out, he goes, I'll keep an eye on it, and then the narrative actually keeps revisiting Cregan, so they're actually really going to develop the Night's Watch, maybe show more than one castle, because it's Cregan having his own storyline there. I don't know. But I've actually planned out 2 podcasts on this. This first one was just everything we know about the state of the Night's Watch in this time period from the books. The follow-up podcast to this, which I'm going to make right after this, is on all of the exciting theories we have about the status of the White Walkers leading up to this, which ties into the central question of why are they coming back specifically now after 8,000 years? And all those other half-remembered legends like the Night's King and other tales of Old Nan, of not the Long Night itself, but vague legends that you wonder, is this something about White Walkers who were still active or like scouts in the intervening millennia? Of what were they up to all this time? That would we see like a proto-craster of some kind? The sacrifices we think were going on, and everything with the Nightfort. So I am going to make... Okay, this is Night's Watch. Please follow me for the next video, next podcast on... It's more theory-based. A lot of it comes from work Preston Jacobs did. He already summarized this very well, of what led to the White Walkers coming back at this point, and if they do have an expedition north, what would they be seeing? Because at first, the first thing we saw in spy photos was that top of the wall. I said, okay, they'll visit the wall. Now we're seeing Night's Watch Rangers in the forest. Are they going to have an expedition or something? That'll be really exciting if it branches off, that Jace does his own storyline and Cregan continues to do things. What are they getting at here? So that's going to be the next video.